I want to welcome everyone to our weekly webinar. We try to do these every week. Last week we didn't quite get our demos done, and so we're doing it this week for the reporting. This will be on YouTube after I'm done, and we will be including quite a few tools for you today. So if you've come to the webinar, don't forget to fill out the survey at the end. We've got a lot of freebies for you, and they usually we sell them, but we're going to give them away for free today. So once again, my name is Patrick, and thank you for joining us today for our weekly webinar. This is a 20-minute webinar, a quick set of demos to show you 3 ways to get data out of your forms. When we talk about, of course, business processes, we have forms, we have workflow, and of course we have data, and we need to do reporting on that data. The first step is to collect the data. That's why you have forms. And then some forms will have some kind of a workflow and approval process. They might have logic in the form. They might have SharePoint workflows that process them. And then at some point in that processing, you will want to extract the data and do reporting. And we're really talking about those second 2 boxes here today, extracting the data and doing the reporting. Why do you care? Well, if you're using simple list forms, maybe you don't care because you've got a table in SharePoint. You can export that to Excel. But for InfoPath forms that have repeating data, you cannot extract that repeating data using the out-of-box SharePoint support. In fact, let me just show you quickly a form I've created last night. My very simple expense report form, just manually created this from scratch. In this form, if I go to File, Form Options, and look at the property promotion, these are the properties that will then be promoted to SharePoint columns. So in my form, I can map my data to SharePoint columns using property promotion. Many of you already know about that. If I try to choose a field that is repeating, and here I have a very simple structure. You can see my data source on the right. It's called expense report, purpose, name, date, total. And then I have repeating number of items because every expense report might have multiple items. And each item has a date, category, which is a drop-down, a description, and then the amount for the item. If I try to promote this to a column in SharePoint, I don't have the ability to separate out each item. And the reason for that is that SharePoint lists and SharePoint libraries are a 2-dimensional flat structure. And that means that you can't take this structure, which you have multiple expense reports, those are multiple rows, but for each row you have multiple items. So you can't map that more higher dimensional structure, XML structure, into your SharePoint list. And so today we're going to talk about 3 ways to extract that data so that you can get at it. But that's the reason for doing this mapping, this extraction. Now, to begin with, you need to make sure that your data source is well organized, that your names for your groups and your fields are set meaningfully. Don't use field 1. You need to also make sure that you've got good data types set. If it's a number, you want to make it a number. If it's a date, obviously date. And lastly, you want to make sure you're using repeating groups and not repeating fields. So in my form here, this is a nicely structured data source here on the right. You can see I've named my fields nodes, so I've got a name for the data source, and each field is named. Now I'm just using lowercase to name them, and you can use any kind of naming convention you want as long as it's consistent. And then I have a repeating structure here, and notice that the repeating structure is in a non-repeating parent group, and that's the default. If you take a look at InfoPath out of the box and you try to add a table, it will create this structure. So if we were to create a simple form in InfoPath and drag this repeating structure from our controls into the form like this, InfoPath is going to do the right thing. It's going to give us a repeating group under a non-repeating parent group. And that's a prerequisite, because if you have a repeating field, it's much more difficult to extract the data that comes after it, because if it's repeating date, you don't know how many there are. This way, this is going to force consistency. There's going to be the same number of each item will have 1 date, category, description, and amount. Okay, so that's a key prerequisite. Now, once you've created a nice form with a good data source and you've started mapping, you've started submitting the form to SharePoint, the first technique we can use is to map the data to one or more SharePoint lists. Obviously, if you don't have a repeating structure, actually, let's do a quick survey here, a quick question first. I wanted to ask everyone how many people are using repeating structures, and just have a very quick poll, and we'll do this and look at people. I'm guessing that most of you do, because InfoPath forms, regular forms in your business process will have repeating structures. List forms are great for configuration data, but they don't support repeating structures. So there we go. That's great. So we have a 95% of you saying yes. Thank you for that quick poll. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about these three techniques. Actually, there's several techniques, but the first technique is to map the data to a SharePoint list, or more than one list, and that's what I'm going to do first. In fact, I'm just going to switch to my demo here, and here I have a 2010 SharePoint site. I've got a form that I can fill out. In fact, I've just filled out 3 forms last night using my simple expense report form. Let's do one for Jennifer. Actually, let's do one for Mel. Mel's going to be your presenter next week. We'll be talking about dynamically changing data connections for your forms on the fly. So let's say that her expense is from last week, and Mel, she has some office expenses. Actually, she has a Skype number that she uses, and it costs $10 a month. And actually, let's add one more expense to this. Let's say that she had a medical reimbursement. So she went to the doctor, and we'll just call this other, and both are other, and let's see, we'll say medical reimbursement, or whatever. And we'll call this $123. Okay, so we're going to submit our forms. Now we have four data forms here in the list. Let's just make sure that went there. It did not go back to the list. What did I do wrong? Okay, so I think the problem here is that I forgot to, well, it's a demo when something goes wrong. And it looks like it might have just overwritten this item here by mistake. That's okay. You see that there's new data. I've got a problem with my my naming convention here. It's not creating the right. Actually, I did the purpose for Mel, and I meant to do the name. So let's just say, let's just do it like this. And then what I'll do is I will edit the one that I created last night, which was training. And we'll just change this one around. We'll just add one item here just to make sure that it's different. We'll call this our coffee, webinar coffee. The expensive coffee here in Seattle. Okay, we'll submit this form out, and this should give us 4 unique forms here. And you can see that we've promoted the sum of the value. I added this promotion after I submitted the first 2, and the promotion, I'm sorry, the property promotion was the sum of the amount. So I can actually aggregate the amount of those expenses, and I can also merge it. And here you see I've merged the expenses onto one line. But this isn't good enough, so I can't actually use this information because it's all in one cell here. So see Mel's expenses there. She's got $10 and $123, and I can't actually do anything with that. With Janice and Bree up above, I did not actually submit their forms before I set up the promotion. That's why you don't see an amount there. So we've got 4 forms. Now what I want to do here is I want to map this data into 2 different lists. Because I have repeating data, I've got the actual header information, who filled out the expense report form, the total amount, what the purpose was, when the date was filed. And then I've got the child information, which is the actual individual items. In Mel's case, it's 2. In my case, it's 1. In Janice's form, let's see, it's 3 items, and so on. In fact, we can, if we submit this again, it will automatically promote those properties. You can see those 3 items there. Okay, so let's map this data to 2 SharePoint lists. Now, there's 2 ways. There's actually several ways to do this. We have, out of the box, you can use a dynamic technique called CAML to map the data when the form is submitted. It's some work to set it up. QRules also has a function to map data to lists, which is easier. And we have a tool that makes it that is another approach. And this approach is to create a mapping, and then what you do is you batch import the forms. So we'll create a mapping here using the form that we just created. And what I'm going to do first is switch back to my form, which I should have here. Make sure this is saved. And then I'm going to attach that form to my mapping tool. And this is my simple expense. And I'm going to type in my URL for my SharePoint site. And you'll get this tool as part of the class today, or part of the webinar. And we're just going to point it at the actual site, and then we'll get the SharePoint lists. And then what we can do is we can specify, okay, I want to map it to simple expense reports. And then for the report, what I want to do is I want to map the data from my root node in my form. And here on the right you see the actual fields from my data source. So I can just choose these. I can just click on the little button here, and then I can choose for the date here, and I can map it to the date in that list. So we'll add a couple mappings. Relatively easy to do. This is the name of the user who submitted the form. And we've got another column for the purpose. And finally, we have one for our amount. It says total in the form, but it's amount in the list. Okay, now we've got our parent list mapping defined. That's how easy it is, right? Now let's add one more mapping underneath this. And in fact, what I want to do is I want to add it. There's my parent mapping. I want to add it using this plus button on the right. And this is going to be to my simple expense items. Now this is a repeating structure, so we're going to check that box to say it's repeating. And instead of choosing the root node in the data source, I'm going to choose the my item node here, which is repeating. And then I just set up the mapping just like I did previously, mapping the date in that field to the date. You can see that the list columns have changed now because I'm in the child list. So I can just go in and map those 4 fields here. Pretty easy to do. Now there's one more thing I need to do after I'm done with this, and that is I need to map to the parent. I need to have a correspondence. And to do that, what we're going to do is add one more mapping. In this mapping, I'm going to choose a special option here, which is the parent list, and we're going to use a report ID for that. Okay, so I've set up my 2 mappings, and now what I'm going to do is save this mapping. So it's easy to save these mappings for future use. You can just save the form. This is just an InfoPath form, so we'll call this a simple mapping. And now what I can do is I can switch to my Import Forms tab, and I can import all those forms. Now, the forms exist on the SharePoint site, so I need to download them first. And you can, because the tool, I don't think the tool will work directly with the SharePoint site, so you just need to actually copy the forms locally. It's a batch operation, so we're going to copy those 4 forms to our folder. We'll just create a new form for simple expenses, and we'll just put them in here. Those are the 4 XML forms. And then what I'll do is I'll go back to my tool and I'll specify that folder. Now, to test this out, you'll probably want to choose one first to make sure that you can do it for one. And so we're going to just run the import. And it's done. So now if we look at our site, we have these 2 lists, the reports and the items. And you can see that we've just mapped out Breeze expense report. So it's working fine for Breeze expense. So let's do it for the others. And what I'm going to do is just run it across all of them. So I'm just going to put in, just delete the sample here. And it doesn't keep correspondence, so you need to go in and actually delete the one that you just mapped, since we already did that one. and we'll point it at, let's see if I can get the right URL here from the Windows Explorer. Okay, so I'm just going to put them all in here, and this should import 3 items. And the operation is finished. Let's go back to our site, and let's take a look at this. And you can see here I have a whole bunch of expense items here in my items list corresponding to those expenses in my reports list. Now, once the data is in the list, now what we can do is we can go into Excel, and we can simply export this data to Excel. And the nice thing about the SharePoint list to Excel mapping is I can actually do it for multiple lists. So I can come in here, and for the second list, I can create a separate worksheet. And see, it should allow us to select a new worksheet here within the existing one. And now you can see I have 2 different tables I've pulled in to my Excel. And then I can create a pivot on top of it, and I can use the full set of Excel goodness, right, to create my my reports. And I'll show you a more extensive example in a second. So that's the first approach to doing reporting. Let's just go back to the slides for a second. So the first approach is to map the data to a SharePoint list, and then to use Excel on top of that to generate a report, maybe a pivot chart, something from the data. And we've got 2 techniques to map, actually 3 techniques to map the data to the list. We've got the out-of-box camel technique in SharePoint, which requires some work, Q-rules mapping techniques, which some of you may be using. And we have now this batch tool that allows you to map data for existing XML documents into a list and do the reporting on them. Now that works great when you've got 5,000 or 10,000 forms. When you have a large data set, the lists don't work so well, mainly because SharePoint isn't meant to handle really large data sets, and you'll want to map the data to a database, and that's the second technique. First, any questions on the first technique? We have one question from Brian. Does the tool work with all SharePoint environments? Yes, it does. I mean, I think what you mean is Foundation or on-premise or cloud-based, and it works with all those 3 environments. It also works with 2007, 2010, 2013. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm using 2010, but we use the tool for 2013 and 2007, and it probably even works with 2003, although it's been a while since we tested with that. So great question. And Greg, to your question then, is it dynamic? No, it's not. The tool is a batch, but for dynamic, if you want to do dynamic, use the Q-rules mapping or use the camel techniques that we've talked about in other webinars. Those are great questions. So let's actually quickly move on then. We've got a few minutes left. I want to talk, I've got a couple more demos to show you, so I'm probably going to go a few minutes over. So we'll get the recording up if you can't stay. Let's talk about the mapping to the database. So I have another tool here that I want to show you. Now I've done this mapping for large sets of data. Well, actually I did it for 473 records last night. So I have an expense report out here. It's all of our expense reports. These are our real expense reports over the last 4 or 5 years. And what I did was I took all 473 of those expenses, and I just ran the tool on them. And so here are my 473 expense reports for the last several years. And I just exported all those from my database, and I just said, well, I'll just run the tool on them. It took about a minute. So about a minute for 500 items. It was actually a little bit less than a minute, about 40 seconds. So you can actually use the tool to go up to 5,000 or 10,000. It's not going to be a huge time sink, but like I said, it is a batch tool. Now let's talk about a couple more tools. So another technique is to use we have another tool. So I just showed you the first tool, and that was the InfoPath SharePoint list tool. And that will be part of the class freebies today if you fill out the survey. The second technique I want to show is to extract the data to a laptop and use another tool that we have called Report Builder. Actually, we're using 2 tools here. And let me just bring up that tool. I think I have it. Actually, I don't have the tool running anymore, so I'm going to launch it. We have a client install that allows us to synchronize data. And here I've actually defined my mapping to, the tool is an InfoPath form. We love InfoPath, right? So the tool actually allows us to download the latest versions of the expense report. And in this case, there's one extra one. This dialog, I'm not sure why I'm seeing this 000, but it is showing us all those expenses. So if I type in 24, for example, and I can search, you'll see all 4 expenses that I just submitted, including the one from this morning. Now, what I can do with this tool is I can actually use another tool on top of it called our Report Builder tool to extract the data from the XML. So let's show this technique quickly. Actually, I've already done this. So let me just launch the report from last night. And I should have it here. Simple expense should be an XML file. There it is. And this, you can ignore this connecting to the web service. The tool works offline, so it allows us to create mappings, queries for our data. And the neat thing about this tool is it doesn't require a database mapping. We're using a local database to store the data and to extract the data, but it doesn't require mapping that XML data to database tables. So if you're not familiar with databases, you can still use this tool. What I've done here is I've created 2 queries. I've created a query to query the expense data, and I've also created a query to query the items. So, and I'm exporting both of these data sets to a spreadsheet that I've stored locally. And if we open up that spreadsheet, we'll see that it only has 3 items in it. Where's my spreadsheet here? So this is the one that I created from the list. Here's the one that I just opened. So you see here I've got 3 reports in there, and I've got a bunch of items. I don't have the one from this morning. So if I close this and run the tool, so I just basically need to query all the items, and then I just export to Excel, it's going to automatically extract the data from that XML and give us all of the data. So you can see here that new expense from Mel for $133, and it extracts it and also exports it to both tables. And this is another technique you can use when you don't want to map the data, because once again, I didn't do any mapping here. I just created a query to extract the data. And of course, the query you could claim is a form of a mapping, but you just save it and you're done. And then you can run it over and over again, and you're just extracting the data. So you're not actually pushing anything to a list or anything. You're just creating the data in Excel. You're basically skipping that middle step of having to extract to a list, and that's because the tool allows you to query multiple repeating data, no matter how deep it is. So that's another technique. Now I've done the same technique on a larger data set, and I have another, all of our 473 forms. I did the same thing with that, and it worked really well. So it's a fast tool, and it works with large data sets. And once again, you will install this standalone form locally, which allows you to create these mappings. And here you can see I've created I've added 2 documents. I can change the image for these, but I've added a document. This one synchronizes to, if we go into Customize here, you can see that the simple expense is synchronizing to that SharePoint site. So it just downloads all of the forms, and it will automatically sync as well. It downloads all the forms to our local machine, and then we use the Report Builder tool on top to actually query it. And you can see this one on top here. You don't have to actually synchronize. You can actually just use it locally, and you can store the data locally in the database tool. And to do this technique, you need SQL Express, which is free. So there's a little bit more installation work for the number 2 technique, but it works really well. Okay, so the last technique, and this is a good technique, by the way, if you don't have a SharePoint site. Obviously, most of you will have SharePoint. If you have data that exceeds 5,000 items, you can use the second technique to do reporting on it and generate quick ad hoc reports. And it's relatively flexible. We do have several customers that use this to do reporting. And also, if you can't install something in your forms or on the server, this technique is a good one because it doesn't require any server-side installation. So any questions on that second technique? And like I said, I'll be including a package to install that with the webinar goodies today. And it's got a license in there that won't expire. That's good for up to 200 forms. And if you need to extend that, just let us know. And so the last technique is mapping it to a database. Now, the good thing about the second technique is it gives us a step in the. Basically, it allows us. It prepares us for the database mapping. Now, let's take a look at my local install. Then I'm going to launch. I think I have here. So when you install the standalone database accelerator on your local machine, you'll get this. This window here at the end of the installation. It installs it using the Windows services, so it's not using IIS, it's just using plain out-of-box Windows 7 services or whatever, Windows 8. And we can launch the admin tool, and you can see here that I've got those two forms launched in my admin tool. I've got 471 documents for the first one and now 4 for the second one. I can go in and I can edit the mapping here, and I can create a database mapping. Now, it just so happens I've already done this for the larger data set. So here I've got 471 documents, and if I go into this mapping, you can see that I've created a very simple mapping from the XML data to my database. And this is very similar to what we did for the lists, except for the fact that we're putting them here in the database. We're mapping to database tables, not SharePoint lists. And this gives us the ability to define foreign keys and do reporting outside of SharePoint for larger data sets. So this is a very simple mapping I set up using this tool, and it's very easy to change these. You just add a column, and you just change the item here, map from. This is the database on the left, and on the right you have the XML schema from your form. You can see it right there. We also have some metadata that you can use. Now, once you've done this, you can shred all of your documents in, and there's 471 of these have been shredded. So then they're in the database. Now, rather than show you what's in the database, let me just launch Excel and connect it to the database. So in Excel, you can actually connect to an existing database. And here I've already done this. You can see here there's all of my data. In fact, it should have 471 records. 469. There's a couple that did not map, and we can actually look at the why they didn't map. It's probably because of the fields exceeded the length that was in my database, and it's easy to identify those and remap them. But you can see most of them were mapped correctly, didn't have any mapping issues, and I can take this data now and I can pivot it in interesting ways. And I think I actually already did this with another spreadsheet. So let's see if this is, I think this might be it. Yeah, so you can see that you can then you can just basically take it, you can pivot your data, and I've pivoted the data from the list. Actually, this is from the SharePoint mapping, but you can see here I can pivot it using a pivot table, and I can look at my expenses across my categories, or I can look at my expenses across my resources. You can see who spent the most money. So that's very simple to do in Excel, and everyone knows and loves Excel here. Now, I didn't talk about SQL reporting, but that would be the next step. And so specifically, let's just go back to technique here. So when you have the data in your database, now you can actually use a SQL report. And SQL is great for when you don't necessarily want people to have to worry about launching Excel. You just want to create a what do you call it? Everything. You want to create a report for them. They go to a website. You generate a report. The report is visible on the website, and they don't have to actually launch Excel and do any kind of pivoting. They can just see the data the way you want to show it to them. So SQL has a reporting tool, report builder. Once again, the SQL version I've got here is just a free version. SQL CE is endowed with about 8 gigabytes of data. So you've got a lot of storage there. Far more than you will need for your reporting. So questions for me. I've got one more poll I want to quickly do. And this is mainly for people who are already doing this. I'm just kind of curious what people are using. Like I said, we'll just run this poll for another 30 seconds here. I will be packaging up all of these tools. Now, you don't get Q rules as part of this, but you get the tool to map to the list. You get the batch tool. And if you're interested in Q rules, that's the first step, because those mappings that we created for the InfoPath to SharePoint list mapping, those mappings can be used in Q rules to do dynamic mapping of the data. So you've got some questions, and if you've got time, I'll answer questions now. I'm going to go back to my slide deck. And so once again, I demoed 3 different techniques today. I talked about mapping to SharePoint lists. I showed you a report builder tool that allows you to query the XML data directly without mapping it to a list. And then I showed you how to map data to a database and use Excel on top of it to extract the data and do pivoting. And these are all techniques. It took me an hour or so to set up the demos last night once I worked through my installation issue I had last week. So it shouldn't take you more than a couple hours to install the tools and get your report ready for management. And we're here to help you if you need help. I'm going to quickly go to the questions, though. And once again, if you fill out the surveys, you're going to get all that swag. So we have here the InfoPath to List tool. There's an installation. So when you get the tool, you will need to run the installer on it. So once you've installed, once you've got everything, and there will be a subset of this, but most of this will be here. What you'll do is you'll take the InfoPath, Qdabra InfoPath to SharePoint list tool right there, and you'll just drag it over the form installer, and then it will install it. And then once you've done that, you can launch it from the filler down below. It's one of the installed forms here. You can see it's right there, and there it is. So that's all that there is to it. Just make sure when you do that that you close all of your InfoPath instances. If you don't close your InfoPath instances, the tool will fail because it's trying to use InfoPath to register the form. So you want to make sure that all of your InfoPath sections are closed. In fact, what you want to do is run the task manager and verify that you don't have any InfoPaths running. And then once you've done that, then you can actually do the form installer tool just like that, and it will run correctly. Now I've already installed it here, so it will either complain that it's already installed or it will tell me it's succeeded. So that's basically what you'll see if you make sure that your forms are all InfoPath forms are all closed before you run it. Okay, and then we do have webinars coming up, so I'm going to answer questions on the. Do we have any questions? So upcoming webinars. Next week, Mel is going to show you how to take your forms offline using a mobile Formotus client. We've been doing a lot of Formotus forms. For those of you who have field workers, the Formotus Rich app is much more performant and has much better stability than InfoPath does when you have a browser that's connected to a 4G network. So the Formotus app is actually a rich client app, and we've done a lot of forms for customers now. Mel's going to show you a couple forms with some really cool controls next week. And then in August, Hillary will talk about how to do that dynamic changing of data connections based on where the form is published. We've got a cool demo there. Jen's going to show you PDF share forms take 2 and show you how PDF share forms can actually support XML. So for those of you looking at migration options, PDF share forms is pretty interesting. And then later in August, Jimmy will talk about 365, and one of our other partners, K2, has a cool new Appit tool that allows you to create workflows, smart forms, and all within the 365 cloud. So it looks like there aren't any questions. But thank you for joining me today. I'll get these items packaged up, and I look forward to sending them. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to contact us. It's webinars@qdabra.com, and you can just send mail to support@qdabra.com. It looks like we have one question here. Oh, thanks, Greg. You're just commenting on my performance here. Let's see. Brian has a question. How do you expose repeating tables in reporting services? So in reporting services, what you're going to do is you're going to map that repeating data to a separate table. So for any time you have a repeating child table, that will become a separate table in SQL. And then once you've done that, the report builder in SQL you can build reports from 2 different tables or more. You can do it from any number of tables. We tend to like Excel here, but SQL reporting tool is very powerful, and we do a number of static reports or automatically generated reports using SQL. 365 doesn't have support yet for SQL reporting services, but it's coming. And if it hasn't arrived already, it's coming. It wasn't there as of a month or so ago. But yeah, any of your BI tools should be able to extract the data from a SQL database if you've mapped it to those tables, parent, child, grandchild, and so on. You're going to be mapping to your relational database, and then the reporting can go on top of that. Great question. Thanks, Brian. Well, I'll just wait another 10 seconds here. Anyone else have another question for me? Now's the time to ask it. We will be posting this video on YouTube, but we will not be posting the swag on YouTube, so make sure you fill out that survey, and we look forward to having you here next